Labadiena, mėly konferencijos dalyviai ir žiūrovai. Esu profesorius Andrius Stasiukinas ir su dideliu džiaugsmu noriu pasveikinti susirinkusius jau į 8-ąją tarptautinę mokslinę praktinę viešojo valdymo pokyčių konferenciją. Ir šiandien mes ją skirsime viešojo sektoriaus veiklai pandemijos sąlygomis, nagrinėsime iššūkius ir tendencijas. Reikia pastebėti, kad nežiūrint, kad viešasis sektorius nuolat yra modernizuojamas, įvairios krizinės situacijos, šiuo atveju COVID pandemija, paskatino iš naujo įvertinti viešojo sektoriaus veiklos tęstinumo galimybės, viešojo valdymo pokyčių ir reformų trajektorijos. Šiandien šiems klausimams ir skirsime mūsų didesnį dėmesį. O dabar kviečiu mano kolegę, docentę daktarę Vidmantę Giedraitytę, kartu tęsti konferencijos moderavimą.
Ačiū Andriau. Labą dieną, mėly konferencijos dalyviai. Taip pat YouTube platformoje konferenciją stebintys svečiai. Labai malonu, nors kol kas tik nuotoliniu būdu, tačiau susiburti ir padiskutuoti aktualiais viešo valdymo pokyčių klausimais. Ir ypač džiaugiamės, jog turime garbingų svečių, kurie maloniai sutiko konferencijos dalyviams tarti sveikinimo žodžius. Taigi, pirmiausia, sveikinimo žodį norėčiau pakviesti tarti Seimo narį, Seimo valstybės valdymo ir savivaldybių komiteto pirmininką Richardą Jušką. Gerbiamas pirmininkė, prašom.
Labadiena, gerbiami konferencijos dalyviai. Labai malonu visus pasveikinti jau tradicinę tapusioje viešojo valdymo pokyčių konferencijoje. Deja, dėl pandemijos pernai metais teko daryti pertrauką, tačiau šiemet grįžtame pasikeitę ir sustiprėję, įgiję naujų patirčių ir kompetencijų. Naujas mūsų konferencijos formatas taip pat puikiai atspindi tiek viešojo sektoriaus, tiek ir kitų sektorių išgyventą virsmą. Būtent apie šį pokytį kelia
for the future that we invite you to debate today. I'm happy to welcome our foreign guests from the USA, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Ukraine. It will be also interesting to hear how the public sector has managed to cope with the challenges of the pandemic in your countries and compare it with the lessons we have learned here. I also welcome the Lithuanian experts, scientists, and practitioners who will have an opportunity to review the success of the Lithuanian public sector. I believe that the opportunity to exchange experiences and views when discussing matters together has a great added value. I hope that today we will sum up the knowledge we all have in order to move to tomorrow even stronger and more prepared for possible new challenges. I'm really looking forward to productive discussions today. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your welcome address. And now I would like to give the floor to another important official, the Minister of the Interior of the Republic of Lithuania, Agnė Bilotaitė. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. I would like to welcome you here at this very important conference, the 8th International Conference of Public Administration Changes, organized by the Committee of State Administration and Local Authorities of the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania, together with partners. The COVID pandemic crisis showed that the states that will be able to act efficiently, innovatively, and flexibly, make quick, determined, and quality decisions, recover faster. It is obvious that we have different situations in different countries today. And of course, an efficient cooperation between public and private sector plays an important role here. When referring to the COVID pandemic and Lithuania's situation, I would like to tell you that we have managed to turn some challenges into opportunities even. We have new services. We are paying more attention to communication and found solutions to adapt to work differently than before. We have had some challenges here in the Seimas also, but our activities have not stopped. We have found new solutions, and it's a very clear signal to us that we are living in the 21st century today, and the changes have to be quite fast. And I believe that the biggest lesson we have learned is that only having an efficient, modern public sector will we be able to cope with the crisis, to take decisions and implement the necessary changes. Without such a public sector, we will be in a more complicated situation. Let me assure you that the government and the Ministry of the Interior sees the transformation of the public sector as one of its challenges and main goals. The transformation of the public service is one of our objectives. And here we have a very important vision to create a modern system of management of human resources. This conference today
daug įdomių ir svarbių įžvalgų ir mes jas galėsime panaudoti.
And we will be able to use them in the transformation while seeking our vision, because our vision is enabled strong leaders in the public sector, motivated staff members, and modern services. And I do believe that by joint efforts we will manage to achieve this goal, because we cannot wait, because the world is getting complex, new challenges arise, and for that we need an innovative and modern public sector. Let me wish you productive and sensible discussion, excellent interaction, new ideas, so that all that will give a big impetus to changes in Lithuania. Have a nice and productive conference. Thank you.
Dėkojame už sveikinimo žodžius. Na, po tokio įkvėpimo.
Thank you for your welcome address. You have given us some inspiration for further work. Now, let us continue to the very contents of our conference. We don't have much time. We have very interesting speakers, and I would like to introduce the star or legend of public administration, Professor Guy Peters. He is known to the representatives of public administration, and we are very glad that we were able to involve Professor in our event. And due to the time difference and some COVID challenges of Professor's family, we asked him to send us a video, and it will be played to you. Well, this is a rather philosophical presentation, I should say. Governing in a time of COVID, the good, the bad, and the normal.
Good morning. I wish I could be with you in Vilnius today, but I can't for the obvious reasons. But I am happy to be able to join you for the conference and at least make some brief comments about the problems of governing in the current crisis, or indeed governing in any crisis situation. Unless you've been asleep for the last year and a half, we've been living in a time of crisis or crises. The most obvious part of this has been the COVID-19 pandemic, but with that has been an economic decline in most of our countries, and in some cases massive declines in economic performance and in the economic well-being of citizens. Problems of, at least in my country, of inequality and racial inequality, and then the combination of these factors to create a real governance crisis for any sitting government in 2021. So the question is, what should we expect from governance in this time? What we should expect, is we sort of assume that there will be doom and gloom. We assume that there will be massive problems, and there have been. But at least at the minimum, though, we should expect change. So no government can really survive without changing to respond to crises of these magnitudes. And some real changes have occurred. But we need to look at these dispassionately and not to always assume it's all going to be doom and gloom, that everything is failing. To look at this and through a variety of different lenses. And particularly to talk about, I'll be talking about public policy and governance and the links then with public administration. So I'm thinking, when I talk about governance, I'm talking about steering the economy and the society toward collective goals, with the assumption, or at least the hope, that those collective goals are set democratically. And essentially are agreed upon by at least one half of the population, and hopefully a bit more. But policy and administration, and public policies and public administration are the mechanisms through which we steer. Governance doesn't occur on its own. Governance occurs through a steering process that uses policy and administration as the mechanisms for bringing about social and economic change. So therefore, when we talk about governing in a time of crisis, we're talking about using public policy and using public administration in a time of crisis. So I'll be talking about the good, the bad, and the merely normal. So a lot of what's happened in the pandemic in governance terms, never mind the public health issues, but what's happened in governance terms has been bad. There have been some real problems for governance that have been addressed not very well in a number of cases. So let me begin with the gloom and the doom. Okay, politically, and I think perhaps most obviously, the crisis has opened the door for extremists. This has been true every time there's a crisis, and it's certainly been true in the current crisis. So historically, any depressions, wars, etc., have opened the doors for political extremists. And this has been true during the current crisis as well, particularly for nationalist politicians. And it has encouraged extremists who are already in office, like our former president here in the United States, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and a number of others. And it's particularly conducive to building illiberal authoritarian regimes. And to some extent, this is natural. So a crisis demands sweeping action. It demands strong government intervention. And so this is the natural turf for authoritarian and illiberal politics. It really provides then the justification for those who may have had those tendencies already. And also the current crisis, and indeed most crises, tend to undermine important institutions. Internationally, the World Health Organization has been undermined, in part by its own doing, but largely because of simply that the pandemic has occurred. The World Health Organization is responsible for world health, therefore it failed. So it's the confidence that people have in that institution has been undermined. This has been very true for the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, which has historically been one of our most respected public bureaucracies. But currently it is in a shambles, in part because it did objectively fail in dealing with the pandemic, but in part also by political constructions, by the complaints, by the dismissal of its officials by political leaders, particularly in the previous administration. The Biden administration is trying to rebuild the CDC, but has taken a major hit from contemporary politics. Also, other institutions, particularly central banks, that have been forced into a stronger role in economic intervention than they might have otherwise taken, simply because of the magnitude of the downturn. So central banks, both in the current crisis and in the previous Great Recession, have become more politically involved than ever before, and have taken on political roles when they might have thought to have been independent in the past. And then finally, as I've intimated before, the current crisis has fostered nationalism. Border controls have gone up. People then want to try to be secure within their own borders. Now, that's usually a false hope in a pandemic, but it's still something that people will try to do, simply because they want to use they want to create as much protection as they can, and somehow building stronger borders will be a part of that. So that's the bad. But the bad then contains several paradoxes. One is that the public expects prompt, effective action from the very institutions that they demean most of the rest of the time. So somehow these very institutions that politically citizens complain about, politicians complain about, are somehow supposed to be able to spring into action and to solve complex health and economic problems simply because the pandemic has arisen. So our expectations about public office are perhaps somewhat overblown in a time of crisis. Likewise, the very institutions that are the most capable of solving the problems, or at least addressing the problems, have been undermined the most. Again, the Centers for Disease Control in the United States is a very good example. And then finally, and most importantly, in terms of these paradoxes, that we never really prepare for crises. We know crises are going to come. We don't know what they're going to be, but they're coming. So when this one is over, just wait for the next one, whether it's a pandemic, natural disasters, whatever. But we don't prepare. We don't tend to forget very quickly that these crises occur. We're not very good at planning. We tend to be optimistic, which is great, but it also helps to be somewhat more, have a greater foresight. We're trying to deal with the future. Let me move on here. Sorry. Okay, so that was the bad and the paradoxes that arise out of the bad. Now for the good. The good, one important thing that's happened during the pandemic is it's opened the door for innovation. Now, this has been true historically, but in other crises. So the welfare state in Europe was to a great extent created after the deprivations of the Second World War and the Great Depression. So without those two crises, the development of the welfare state might have been much slower. So we respond, we innovate when we see a crisis. During the Great Recession, beginning in 2008, again, central banks became more important economic actors and developed new mechanisms for dealing with with public finance problems, particularly quantitative easing. So we innovated, and it worked. I mean, not as well as we might have liked, but it worked. And the current crisis is opening ways for change. Healthcare in the United States is becoming more public, finally. Even with the Affordable Care Act, it wasn't nearly as public health hadn't developed, public health insurance had not developed to the extent that would be possible and desirable, but has moved more now after the pandemic. And in some countries in Europe, beginnings of a guaranteed income as a social policy. And crises can also reinvigorate old institutions, federalism in the US and indeed in other federal systems in the Americas. There's been a major revival of federal solutions to problems that have become more centralized. And the pandemic has also exposed the weaknesses of some poorly functioning institutions. Niall Ferguson wrote a very nice book some 15 years ago called The Audit of War. And the argument being then is that war or other crises essentially strain institutions and are a good test upon the quality of the institutions and good ways of learning about how to make them better. Likewise, the wisdom of old policies has become more apparent. Public health versus curative medicine. So that in many countries, the old-fashioned public health, where you deal with with contact tracing, you deal with basic, epidemiology types of issues, has been devalued in favor of focusing on curative medicine, in part because we thought we had solved most of the major epidemic diseases, again, until this one arose. So public health has been devalued. Now it has to be rebuilt. But at least we understand now how important public health is. It's also produced higher compliance by the public and sometimes incredible sacrifice by public servants who have been real heroes on the front line. And then finally, a lot of what's happened in this crisis and in others is merely normal. Most of what government has done is business as usual. So most government departments have been influenced by the pandemic, but it hasn't been their central focus. Policy making has been accelerated in some instances, but very much the same. The processes remain the same. And indeed, it may have been easier. So for making public policy, barriers have fallen. We know what the problem is, we know it's on the agenda, and government has more latitude for action. And let me just point out a few important aspects of that normal functioning of governance during the crisis. One is that policymaking is experimentation. We often forget that we all don't know a whole lot at times when we intervene, particularly in social policies. So we've been reminded during the pandemic that a lot of what we're doing is experimentation. Secondly, and obviously, policy problems are complex, and that complexity has come out, and the interlinkage among policies has come out. Though that a health issue then produces economic, social, other types of problems that have to be dealt with together if they're going to be dealt with successfully. Success in policy and governance is difficult to define. My success may be your failure. So if we vaccinate 70% of the population, is that success? Or do we need to get to 90 or 100% to really be successful? Fourthly, that a lot of the politics that we face around a crisis or any policy making is bureaucratic politics. We're dealing with institutions that have interest. And in the case of the US, the Centers for Disease Control, the White House, the National Institutes of Health, state health departments, local health departments have been involved in a contest for power during the crisis. Now, they've been trying to work together, but they've also had their eyes on who wins in this difficult and complex policy issue. As I've already said, no one problem is isolated, no matter how important it is. They all link together. And then in international terms, national borders are largely irrelevant for crisis. Viruses don't really care much about international borders. They cross them relatively easily. And the same thing is true for economic problems, for poverty, for inequality. And a lot, this is perhaps a particular interest of mine, but many people have discussed the current problem or the current pandemic as being a wicked problem. And the term wicked problems is used all too much. But in many ways, the pandemic is a very simple problem. We know the cause, we know the solution or solutions. Some of them are masking, social distance. The ultimate solution will be vaccination and herd immunity. So it's actually a relatively simple problem. What makes it more difficult and more complex is the interactions with other policy domains, like the economy and the society. But even then, if we can solve, which we can, the pandemic, then we can address those other problems. So, but the major one that comes out of this, that may really be a wicked problem, is inequality. And that inequality has been exacerbated during the pandemic and is likely to persist afterwards. So that's where the real wickedness may occur, is not with the health issues, but with the subsequent social issues. So in summary, governance is always a challenge, and governing well is always a challenge. Crisis may not make it easier, but sometimes crises do break down barriers to change. So crises can produce innovation, and it can make transformation of the policy and administration a lot easier. It's difficult to be terribly optimistic now, even with vaccinations, but yet there is hope. And there's some general hope then that crises and pandemics need not defeat us. We merely have to learn how to govern better and administer better to deal with these not wicked, but certainly complex and difficult problems. So thanks for your attention. Thanks for having me make this short talk. And I wish you good luck with your conference. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Štai, išgirdome pranešimą, labai gaila, kad neturime.
Thank you so much. It is a pity that we don't have a possibility to ask Professor questions. And I haven't mentioned that we are going to have Q&A session just after our discussion, after we hear all the presentations. And now I am delighted to give the floor to another notorious expert of public administration in Europe, who is often consulting the governments from the University of the Czech Republic, Professor Dr. Juraj Němec. And his presentation is on collaborative governance during the COVID-19 pandemic, with a focus on the Slovak experience. The floor is yours.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear organizers, thanks very much for the invitation or for the option to participate in this conference. And it's a really honor for me to speak after Professor Peters, who is guru of our discipline. Now I will try to share my screen, hope it will work. Can you see it here? Okay, so together with my colleagues from Masaryk University in Brno, my colleague from Masaryk University in Brno, Ivan Mali, and with Daniel Klimovsky from Comenius University in Bratislava, we are working together on more papers evaluating problems of governance, problems of public administration during COVID-19 pandemics. This presentation tries to summarize some findings, especially from the point of view of collaborative governance. So the research goal is formulated that using the concept of collaborative governance, we try to assess what governments have done to protect their countries against COVID-19 spread. And the specific goal for this presentation is to try to assess, again on the above basis, why Slovakia achieved so different results. And not only Slovakia, but most of our countries in Central and Eastern Europe achieved really different results for first and second phase of pandemics. There is some assumption, and I can even skip slide and go directly here. So in some papers, you can find this assumption mentioned on previous slide, that governments with limited quality of governance or with limited capacity of public administration, I can say that all our countries in Central and Eastern Europe belong to the group of governments with limited public administration performance and limited quality of governance. Maybe your Baltic countries are doing a little bit better. Congratulations. But you may know about the project EUPAC, or EUPAC, where public administrations of all European Union member countries are evaluated and somehow ranked for different criteria of performance of public administration. And it's very visible that for most indicators, countries from our region are not in the top. Still, yes, Baltic countries, especially Lithuania and Estonia, are doing good for some indicators. Countries where I work, Czech Republic, or where I live, it's Slovakia, are for most indicators on the bottom of the scale. So there was, if you look on this classification by Capano, it's relatively well known. Many academicians expect that governments who don't have experience with similar type of crises, which is true for our region, during our recent history, we did not have such kind of pandemics. It's first time for us, and which have also limited quality of public administration, should have problems, be late, slow, delivering panic response, and so on and so on. So we should be the group of, let's say, least quality of reaction to COVID-19 pandemics. All our countries from the region, and even more countries, which, as I indicated, Slovakia, Czech Republic, where I have my activities or main activities. However, this expectation was not, and it's very good to know and also to inform everybody worldwide that because our region is not anymore in the center of focus of international community, that we were more or less all our countries performed very well during the first wave of pandemics. And this was despite, so we were not prepared, we have problematic quality of collaborative governance of public administration and so on, but we achieved really excellent results. I don't have Lithuania on this slide, but it was also very good, performing relatively very good, but you can see international comparison related to the first wave on this slide. And at that time, Slovakia was probably the best, or at least one of the best performers, except for some Asian countries. It was very low number of cases, And for a given period, Slovakia recorded only 28 persons who died because of COVID. Yes, statistics, you may not trust fully to statistics, but the number of people who died in the first phase was really, really small. And you can see also the official statistics about the number of infected shows significant differences and very good performance in our region. So it's really very important to try to understand why, if I go back to this slide, the expectation of academic literature of most experts was that we will have to focus, or we will have to cope with really critical problems during the first phase of pandemics. This did not happen. The question is why. We have some, or we can propose, we don't have any definite answer in public sector, or if for crisis, for VIII problems, as Guy Peters mentioned, or named pandemics, there are no definite answers. But there are some interesting features, not only fast and comprehensive reaction, which is not on this slide, but some other interesting elements or aspects connected to the first phase of pandemics. So not only our countries delivered very comprehensive and relatively fast response, this can be checked in several international statistics, which are available worldwide. But what we feel is also important, I don't know about Lithuania, but in Slovakia and Czech Republic, first phase was connected with really high level of compliance. So people more or less voluntarily accepted and followed all restrictions, all measures. Protective masks mentioned by Guy Peters were not a problem, but almost everybody agreed to use them. There was very high level of solidarity, help to, again, Guy Peters mentioned inequality. During first phase, a lot was done to deal with inequality, how to help to marginalized groups. You can sometimes find some articles about Slovakia written by people who don't live in this country and who know everything about our country. You may know this kind of experts. And they write, or they have commented in Slovakia, army was used to work with Roma population, but it was really not any, let's say, forced and force-based attempt, but army was there to help, to bring them food, to deliver some services and so on, because it was necessary to also isolate some Roma settlements because of starting spread of virus. So army was there to help, not to deliver any kind of forced action. I live in the country, I know. A very interesting issue is fear, especially against Slovakia. In early phase of pandemics, the ministry or policy unit at the Ministry of Health published some expected indicators, or their own expected opinion about development of COVID pandemics. And their prediction was that maybe 50% of population may become ill in early phase of pandemics, that there will be thousands of deaths and so on and so on. So it created atmosphere of fear, and people who did not experience anything like this before, you can also indicated, complied with measures, tried to accept social distancing and so on and so on. It's even interesting that during the first phase, politics was a bit aside. Again, back to Slovakia, in March 2020, new government, opposition government came into the power, and there was no problem when switching between former government and the new government created or constructed only from opposition parties. They worked together before the change, and there was some kind of cooperation between coalition and opposition also after the change of government. So some very interesting features which are summarized by that expression, we can do it together. So not only size and timing of reactions, but some very interesting features which can serve as some to explain why the first phase was so successful. You can even see this on this slide, which is comparing last year, 2020, and this period of first phase is almost invisible on incidence curve. Everything happened in the second phase. So why the second phase was so problematic in Slovakia, in Czech Republic, where I know all facts, but in most countries from Central and Eastern Europe, which were quite successful. And now we can say that this expectation that low quality of governance can have impact on quality of government responses or collaborative was confirmed in the second phase. So maybe the first phase was short time mobilization of everybody, but the second phase was natural picture of capacity of our governments to cope with COVID. What happened, and not only in Slovakia, but most facts are from Slovakia, compared to first phase, where the reaction was very fast, Slovakia implemented first measures before having first COVID case in Slovakia. So we started with social distancing, with border control before pandemic appeared in the country. Now, in summer, it was already visible for everybody that pandemic is back, and there was no reaction by government. We have in our articles quotation of Czech Prime Minister who told in Parliament, stop discussing COVID. We have now more important topic, which is law about gardening. The Slovak Prime Minister told, brides, don't worry. We will not have problems. Everything will good. Your weddings will go on, and so on and so on. So it was rhetoric. Everything is fine. We have everything under the control till late September, where leaders of countries discovered that we are in real problem, that COVID is back, and were not able to react in any systematic way. So it was set of chaotic measures till the end, at least till the end of 2020, trying to react to COVID-19 pandemics. Second, collaborative governance should be based on working or co-creation, cooperation, working, consultation, working with all stakeholders. Especially Slovakia is a very bad example now of Prime Minister who thinking that he is the only clever leader in the country. He did not consult, he did not follow any kind of advice, and just his ideas had to be implemented. It was very, very bad period. The Prime Minister is not anymore in the function because of all his critical failures during the pandemics. It's one of the results. It is good to mention for Slovakia, we are the only small to medium-sized country which realized compulsory blanket testing. So in November and then again in January, whole country was tested more or less in compulsory way by antigen tests. And the data show that this idea, which Prime Minister named it nuclear weapon against COVID, did not work at all, especially according to opinion of experts. November testing, which was chaotic, not organized, delivered maybe spread of infection and not control over infection. People queuing for hours for testing, sometimes inside, so a lot of social contacts. And as everybody should know, antigen testing is very of limited reliability. Quality of communication, another feature. It was a little bit problem also in the first phase, but the communication in the second phase, I indicated some examples of prime ministers, but in Slovak Republic, the quality of communication or non-quality of communication of prime minister crossed any borders. Yeah, you can see one of really interesting statements of our prime minister, Slovak prime minister, on the bottom. Yeah, and already also Guy Peters mentions that vaccination, and I have it also on my final slide. Everybody is aware that at this moment vaccination is the most important, but at time of his nuclear weapon in antigen testing, he was criticizing even the idea that we need vaccination. So it's really disaster. Last problem or last issue of collaborative governance in autumn, winter, so during the second phase, politics returned back, and people, citizens are not anymore supported by public policy during COVID, but are victims of political fights during COVID. Yeah, so opposition is back to its standard way of working in at least two countries, Slovakia, Czech Republic. Everything proposed by coalition is neglected by opposition. Everything proposed by opposition is neglected by coalition. We are just enemies. We are fighting. We don't work together. And interesting Slovak case are fights also within the coalition. I indicated Prime Minister has to resign, and the final point or final mechanism, final issue was the problem of Sputnik. Without any consultation in government, our Prime Minister imported Russian vaccine Sputnik, which is still not approved by European Union and still in our stores in Eastern Slovakia. Maybe we will start using it next month, but it's still open. But it was without any consultation, even within the coalition, and other coalition parties decided that it's too much, and they forced Prime Minister to resign. So, summary, seems that mobilization of all actors helped to achieve short-term success in spring. As already mentioned, and I provided examples, and also as already mentioned, all these collaborative governance failures, which were somehow highlighted also in the presentation, are behind real failures which happened during the second phase. And as also Guy Peters mentioned, at this moment, for countries like Slovakia, Czech Republic, vaccination is the only light at the end of the tunnel. So let us to hope that it will work. But I'm maybe a little bit less optimistic than Guy Peters. I'm a bit afraid that we will live with COVID for several coming years. And this is, again, one problem of collaborative governance. We are still not ready to learn to live with COVID. Our governments are prohibiting and not teaching us. So thanks very much for your attention.
Ačiū labai, profesoriui.
Thank you very much, Professor Nemitz, for this extensive explanation of your country's experience. I want to give the floor to the next speaker. He's our constant guest at different conferences. It's Professor Dr. David Schultz from Hamline University. Well, despite being 2 a.m. in Minnesota, Professor does not miss our events and participates in them. So Professor will speak about managing a crisis, a comparison of the American presidencies of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Professor Schultz, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much for allowing me to participate today. Of course, I only wish that I could be in Vilnius for this conference, and we can all hope that at some point in the near future, we'll all be reunited and be able to do this in person. It's also an honor to be following the previous two speakers, and in many ways, I hope I'll be able to contribute equally in terms of my observations and comments. What I want to talk about today is really drawn from a paper that I did late last year, early this year, in which it was an effort to try to assess the overall capacity of the Trump administration after its one term in office in terms of public administration. Because of course, lots of people had looked at the Trump administration from a variety of perspectives. And so mine was really keying in on the public administration aspect, its philosophy, its handling of a variety of issues. And more importantly, for our purposes today, I want to focus in on eventually the handling of the pandemic, and then do, of course, a contrast between the Trump administration and the Biden administration so far. Of course, we're only, 4 months into the Biden administration in terms of the handling of the pandemic. As I begin my presentation, I really want to tell you two stories right off the bat, which I think tell us a lot about what I want to do today. And the first story actually takes place back in 2008, and it occurred when I first visited Lithuania. I had the honor of visiting your country at the request of the US State Department, which wanted me to tour the Baltic states plus Finland and talk about the 2008 presidential election, which then you might recall featured Barack Obama versus John McCain. And I had a very, very astute student ask me a question in Lithuania. And it was, early October. It was pretty clear at that point that Barack Obama was going to win the election. And the student turned to me and said, well, how do you think Barack Obama's foreign policy is going to differ from that of George Bush, who was the current president? And I thought that was a really good question. I thought about it, and I said to them, the best predictor of the next president's foreign policy in the United States is to look at his predecessor. And the reason why I said that is that new presidents in the United States take office within a historical context. They inherit the world, the office, the problems, the crises, the good things that the previous president has left them. And that's my first story to think about here, is how when Joe Biden took office on January 20th this year, he inherited the world and the public administration that Donald Trump had left to him. And what he needed to do was to leave his imprint. And eventually what I'm going to argue is that the Biden administration's handling of the pandemic both represented some continuities with what the Trump administration did, but also some pretty significant breaks where the Trump administration was. Thus, one can almost describe what's happened in the last 4 months in the United States as a transition. And I'll highlight that in a few minutes here. The other story I want to say is about another comment a student of mine made. And it was about a month and a half ago. And one of my students was from Mexico. And he actually was taking the class in the United States while still living in Mexico. And during the course of the conversation in class, we were talking about how in the United States, we had a segment of the population that was just refusing to be vaccinated. I know in the UK, they use the word jab. We use the word vaccinated in the United States. And we were talking about how this refusal might be compromising the ability of us to be able to achieve the type of success in terms of controlling the virus. And the student from Mexico turned to the class and said that the issue that you're describing is what he called the problem of the first world. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, in your country, because of the availability of the vaccine, you folks have the leisure of being able to say no to the vaccine. He said, in Mexico, where I am, because the vaccine is not even available, we don't even have the freedom to say yes or no to whether we should have a vaccine. And I want us to keep that story in mind, because the availability of the vaccine, the production in the United States, especially under the Biden administration, and how the Biden administration has not yet been, let's say, as generous as it could in exporting our surplus vaccines to the rest of the world, represents both a continuity and a break with the Trump administration. So I want us to keep those stories in mind as I start to develop my argument here. Now, as we start to think about the contrasts between both Biden and Donald Trump, let's just think a little bit about the context of when Donald Trump became president of the United States back in 2017. And as I argue and talk about in one of my papers, if I could just read to it for a second here. By all measures, Donald Trump entered the US presidency as possibly the least qualified person in American history. He had never held elected position. He had never held any appointed position in government at any level. He had no foreign policy or domestic policy experience. He had no training as an attorney or in public policy and administration. His qualifications to be president rested in his celebrity status and his appeal as an outsider to the government. And he pledged to drain the swamp in Washington, D.C. The point that I'm getting at is that when Donald Trump became president of the United States, he did so not because he brought the traditional qualifications of public administration to office. He was what? He was a business person. He was a host of a very popular television show in the United States for 17 years. He was a self-promoter. He was not somebody who brought with him skills of public administration. Moreover, when he ran for president, as I pointed out, he ran as an outsider, criticizing people such as then Secretary Clinton, remember, who had been Secretary of State, a former senator, criticized people like her as being insiders, and that instead what he needed to do was to come to office as that total outsider. In his acceptance speech, when he accepted the nomination to run for president of the United States, he famously said that only he could solve the problems in Washington. Only he, because he was an outsider. Only he, because of his experience as a head of a business, as a CEO, could solve these problems. Those were his qualifications running for office. When he was elected with an opportunity, perhaps, to do things. The Republican Party had control of both the US Senate, our upper legislative chamber, and the House of Representatives, our lower chamber. He had a unified government to be able to do things. He also, at the time that he took office, had taken office with a divided American society. He was taking office at a time when his approval ratings, according to opinion polls, made him the least popular person to start or take office, as long as we could tell in terms of public opinion polls. The picture that I was trying to paint here is about his qualifications, about his context. He also took office as a person who ran against the rest of the world. He ran against immigrants. He ran against the multilateral agreements that previous presidents had put into place. Most recently, for example, with Barack Obama, in terms of things such as what? The Paris Environmental Accords or the Iran nuclear agreement. Donald Trump questioned the value of the European, or rather of NATO. He ran as a president and took office as a president, claiming that his personality, his personalization of running the presidency would be critical to his ability to be able to be successful in terms of moving the United States first. And in fact, his slogan, America's First, Make America Great Again, all signaled that he would be taking a very ultra-nationalistic approach across the world. I think Guy Peters talked a little bit about that in his opening statement. Once he took office, what became fascinating about Donald Trump was that his administration was of at least two minds. Mind one was this notion of saying that he wanted to move a politically conservative agenda in the United States. Very quickly, he moved, and with Congress's support, he managed to pass a very, very large tax cut in the United States that benefited the wealthy in the United States. But after that, at least domestically, he largely did not accomplish anything for the next 4 years. Instead, what happened is that because of his inexperience in government, he never realized that there is a difference between being a CEO of a company and being the head of a country. A country like the United States, with a complex governing system of checks and balances, of separation of powers, with members of Congress independently elected. And very quickly, he went to war, even with his own party, even when he had essentially a majority. If I could do a parallel to a parliamentary system, he had a governing majority in Congress. He was so antagonistic, so much fighting with his majorities, that he was unable to move anything else. And that dominated his first 2 years. And then, of course, when the Democrats took control of the House of Representatives, that largely halted most of his domestic agenda in the United States, forcing him to use executive orders again to try to make small changes domestically. Of course, internationally, Donald Trump might have been more efficacious. Many of you know from being external observers to the United States that he did a variety of things. Presidents in the United States have more freedom internationally. So he pulled us out of, as I mentioned, the Paris Accords, the Iran nuclear agreement. He enunciated a significant trade war with the People's Republic of China. We had a stare down at one point with the Democratic Republic of Korea. He at points questioned, again, as I mentioned, the value of NATO. He had a foreign policy that took a very crude version of America First. He had a foreign policy that he personalized with the relationships that he's developed, and a foreign policy that viewed every relationship with every country as a zero-sum game. But what becomes interesting about his presidency also is, as I started to mention, is that on the one hand, he wanted to move a conservative agenda. But on the other hand, especially in the opening year, under the influence of his advisor, Steve Bannon, he also waged a war essentially against what Steve Bannon called the deep administrative state. And if we look at what really characterized the Trump administration and public administration, and I'll get to the pandemic in a second here, was this almost schizophrenic, almost two-personality view of government. On the one hand, trying to use government for achieving, again, his political objectives. On the other hand, so much attacking it, so much disabling it, that he crippled the ability of his administration to accomplish things. Trump himself, because of his lack of skills in government, largely didn't understand how to move the levers of government. He largely appointed people who did not know how to do that. And when he had chiefs of staff who were skilled, who understood how to do things, very quickly he disavowed them. In the same way that he disavowed, for example, the foreign policy establishment in the United States. I could obviously talk much more detail about this approach. But when we get to the pandemic, Donald Trump also approached the pandemic consistent with his broader approach to government. On the one hand, there was denial that there was a pandemic, at points dismissing it as what, no more than what, being like a flu-like symptoms or a cold, or that it would pass quickly, or that in March of 2020 saying that by summer it would disappear with warmer weather. At another point, he labels the pandemic as a problem of China, calling it what, the Chinese flu or the Chinese virus or something. So there was this denial of the reality, viewing the virus, the reality of it as merely a personal referendum on him and how it would affect his 2020 election prospects. And so early on in March, in April, and perhaps into May of 2020, it was mostly denial. And many people who specialize in health in the United States say that we lost at least a month, a critical month in terms of addressing the pandemic. His failure to sort of encourage people to wear masks, to social distance, his failure to cooperate with states, the individual states in the United States, to help them in terms of getting needed medical supplies, all were characteristic of what the broader public administration way the Trump administration had acted in terms of what, not having the competent, skilled people in place to address the issues. And internationally, he also failed to cooperate with other countries, including what? Eventually trying to pull the United States out of the World Health Organization. The only thing that he marginally did that might have helped was that early on, he enunciated what was called Operation Warp Speed. For those of you who are fans of old American television, what warp speed is a phrase that came from Star Trek, an old 1960s science fiction television show about warp speed traveling very, very quickly. And he provided resources and support, that is Donald Trump, to try to get a vaccine to market very quickly. He also purchased in advance, supposedly, hundreds of millions of vaccines were they to become available. Now, there's a big debate regarding whether the Trump administration was successful in actually the development of the vaccine. It's more likely it was the pharmaceutical companies that were in place to do it. But when he left office with the vaccine available, at least in theory, with states on a position, individual states, of being able to deliver and vaccinate people. Enter Joe Biden. If Donald Trump entered office as arguably one of the least qualified people by traditional measures to be president of the United States, Joe Biden might have entered office as one of the most qualified people. 37 years as a US Senator, 8 years as a vice president. I would say 45 years of experience, that's pretty good. He was the consummate Washington insider. He was a again, vice president under Barack Obama, a very close advisor to him. He brought Washington connections, Washington skills in terms of what he did. When he got elected, he represented a contrast in styles. Yes, he took office also with majorities in Congress, although by the thinnest of margins. He also took office with far greater approval ratings than Donald Trump, but he took office with what? A very, very divided American public. But he inherited, and this goes back to my opening statement, he inherited the world of Donald Trump, a foreign policy world, a world where he had to perhaps try to repair the damages that the Trump administration had wreaked about the ultranationalism. He also inherited the public administration capacities and the government structures that Donald Trump had left him. When he took office, he said, that Joe Biden, and I should be done in about 2 minutes, by the way. He said that his two priorities were going to be what? First, address the pandemic, and two, recover the economy. And the things that Biden has done so far have largely lived up to that. He improved the capacity to deliver the vaccines to the states. He passed a massive stimulus bill, of which we're going to still see the impact. And what we've seen in the first 4 months of the Biden administration is a fairly successful rollout of the vaccine domestically, to where in half the states, over half the adult population is vaccinated. We're still trying to figure out how to get to those people who don't want to get the vaccines. And the economy seems to be doing fairly well. My point being, my last 2 points here is one, is that the differences in handling of the two administrations of the pandemic represent differences in personality, styles, experience, and approaches to government. But finally, while domestically the United States is on the road to recovery, we still have to think about how the US approaches pandemic politics. At what point does the Biden administration make the vaccines available to Lithuania, to the Czech Republic, to the Slovak Republic, to other countries of the world? So this is where I'll stop by saying that the two administrations and their handling of the pandemic, that pandemic represents sort of what a microcosm of the broader differences between the two. Thank you very much.
Dėkuoju profesoriau, dėkuoju už tokį išsamų.
Thank you, Professor, for such a comprehensive comparison. Now we have some question time. Vidmante, do we have any questions from YouTube, or do we have any questions from our audience here? Mr. Uranis and Mr. David Schultz. If there are no questions, maybe I could ask a few things. First of all, Professor Juraj Niemec, if I can. The question is as follows. Currently, in the context of the pandemic, researchers often speak about involvement of different stakeholders into the control of the pandemic. What is your approach about the Slovakian experience in involving business representatives, NGOs, the population in controlling the pandemic, if you may?
Okay, I can try to respond immediately. The situation, as indicated on my slides, was very, very bad in winter. Now with new Prime Minister, it's improving. But we had a very nice presentation about capacity of government of US President. And our case of Slovak Prime Minister was very, very similar. Person without any experience in politics. His only experience was criticizing ruling government. and bringing into power, into administration structures, people without any experience in delivering governance or in governance. So in winter before the change of government, there was no collaboration between government or even between prime minister and stakeholders. Physicians, experts, virologists proposed that we have to have different way of testing, not this blanket testing. People from business advising, trying to tell to government how to help to business. Nothing was respected and heard by prime minister. We can, in Slovak, we can call him Len on, only him. So this was disaster. This was example how governance should not be delivered, and good, interesting lesson for future. It's even question for political scientists, how it's possible that this kind of person can lead a country. How it is possible? Who is responsible? Thanks very much for question.
If I can add a couple of comments also, what I find really kind of interesting is, I think Guy Peters talked about this, how crises can reveal both strengths and flaws in your structures. And I mention this because that in the United States, as we know, we have one of the oldest, written constitutions in the world. As I say to my students, the basic structure of our government goes back to 1787. A political and constitutional structure that at the time that was designed not to allow for legislation to occur, but to limit the capacity of governments to act in order to limit political power. And again, as I mentioned to my students, we have a very complex political system here. We've got checks and balances. We have separation of powers. We don't have a parliamentary system at all. But we also have something else. I'm going to get to this exactly here in a second here. We also have this system of federalism. And the federalism, which is the division between national powers and our 50 states, was originally put into place for checking political power, as our framers were fearful of, 200 some odd years ago. They were fearful of a powerful king, fearful that some group, faction, the word they used, would take over the government. And therefore, by dividing us between a national government and states, and then across lots of states, we would make it very difficult in case somebody like Schultz decided to be a power monger and to try to take over things. Well, federalism has its benefits, but I'm going to argue that federalism revealed powerful flaws in the U.S. handling of our pandemic. Without going into too much detail, the basic functions for addressing public health in the United States are constitutionally delegated to states and not the national government. The Center for Disease Control, the National Institute for Health, largely has advisory powers, largely has research powers. The national government, for example, in Washington, does not have the authority, for example, to order people to wear masks or not wear masks, did not have the authority to be able to say businesses open, businesses closed, or get vaccines or not. That all falls under our political system to the different states. And as we saw in the United States, the problem of the pandemic is a collective action problem that all 50 states had to work together because pandemics don't recognize borders, they cross them. And we saw patterns across the United States where the federalism revealed the basic flaws in the US handling the pandemic in the same way that the pandemic might, or rather in the same way that federalism might show other problems in terms of governance in the United States. And the reason why I mention this is that on one level, the United States with its 50 states is like the European Union. And what I mean by that is that in the European Union, you have your 27 member states, who all took different approaches to handling the pandemic and achieving the collective action that was necessary to be able to really address the problems. Maybe similar policies regarding masks or distribution of vaccines or whatever it may be. Reveal what? Both the strengths and the weaknesses of the European Union governance. And so the point that I'm making here is that while Guy Peters said that this brought back federalism in the United States, I'm more pessimistic than him, that I think the federalism revealed the basic weaknesses that the United States faces in terms of addressing a pandemic issue, much in the same way. And I would invite you folks to comment who are much better experts than I am in terms of how the collective action problem within the European Union challenged the addressing of the pandemic there.
Tai dėkoju gerbėmiems profesoriams už išsamius atsakymus.
Thank you to both professors. Unfortunately, we don't have so much time. I see we do have some comments in YouTube channel. I don't see a specific question. And I'm also glad that people are reacting. But let me now shift to our next part of the session, which is a debate, a discussion with policy makers, experts about challenges of the pandemic in the public sector. I will ask Vidmantė to present participants of our discussion. Yes, thank you. So, first member of the Committee on State Administration and Local Authorities of the Parliament, Rita Tamašūnienė, Vice Minister of the Interior of the Republic of Lithuania, Sigita Ščejavienė, Mayor of Kazlų Rūda, Mantas Varaška, Professor Vainius Smalskys, Head of Public Administration Studies of Mykolas Riomeris University, and Vice Rector for Science and Studies of General Jono Žemaitis Military Academy of Lithuania, Professor Dr. Mantas Bileišis. Hello to everyone. I'm glad to see all of you here. Unfortunately, I don't see Mantas Varaška among you, the mayor of Kazlų Rūda. Maybe he will join us later, but we are starting the discussion anyway. We will have the principle of panel discussions, if you don't mind. I will ask you a question, and you will have up to 5 minutes to respond. And then we will have the following question again. And then we will have some reactions, comments. After the first round, after the first answer, you can present your remarks to make your contributions if you are interested. So, the first question. What main challenges will you name in public sector during the pandemic? What needs to be improved? Maybe we'll start from Rita Tamašūnienė.
Hello, I thank the organizers for the traditional discussion, which is very important nowadays. I actually was person responsible for managing the pandemic from the Ministry of the Interior. And according to our system of emergency, the Minister of the Interior was responsible for many issues. We were one of the first in Europe to announced the state of emergency, and it allowed many state institutions and domestic services to prepare for different regulations and requirements. Now, actually, the life now is under the quarantine, and the pandemic has taught the public sector to work in a different reality, and this is a positive development. Speaking about the challenges, I try to analyze this, and I want to speak about the weaknesses and about the facts that all those challenges open new possibilities, and those possibilities will uh, uh, remain after this pandemic. First of all, I believe that preparation for the emergency situation was mostly on paper and on the level of exercise. We have to speak about the reserve of the state, about the inclusion of the private sector, and also leadership in taking decisions. While we had a very complex system, which was very difficult to understand by the public, general public, the new government promised to change the management of this state of emergency system. And some actions have already been taken. The previous government had a COVID committee under the government, and this government strengthened the team of experts. Which of the two models is most effective? We will see that in the future. Another important challenge was the cooperation among the central government and local governments. We had some failures in cooperation and communication, also with the social partners and private sector. The pandemic gave us more empathy. We have to foster our trust and confidence in each other, and we have to allow local governments to take more decisions, or at least take some pilot decisions, which really happened on several occasions. The practices that have already been implemented can be called best practices. They could be implemented on a wider level. We also saw some failures to provide for necessary equipment from schools to municipalities. This is also a challenge that we faced, and communication certainly. And this is actually the weakness, I believe. There were some failures to differentiate among the targets group, to differentiate among the contents of the messages to different targets group, and reaction to fake news. People actually are the most reliable sources of information, but also the most vulnerable and susceptible to false information. Well, we had many strengths, of course, and they could be used in public sector. Thank you. Well, the next question will be about the best practice. And now I would like to give the floor to Sigita Šejavienė to react to this. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, participants of the conference. I'm glad to see former Minister of the Interior in this discussion. we also take over the implementation and addressing the challenges. What I thought a lot about the main points for this discussion. The pandemic was the period which was complicated for the entire public sector. It demonstrated not only the weaknesses, but also sped up some new forms of work, new forms of activity. We found new opportunities to take some more novel decisions. And one of the most major challenges that the public sector faced was that the institutions face the lack of competences to manage the pandemic measures. The government had to take certain decisions for managing the pandemic, but for a successful implementation of those measures, we needed speed and effectiveness. And those measures had to be applicable and comprehensively applicable. Comprehensively, I mean that the public sector had to have the skills to choose the best measure at the most appropriate time. And therefore, the responsibility of institutions actually led to the complexity of communication and messages. What could be improved and what should be done as soon as possible? First of all, we have to clearly define the functions of the institutions. This is something that is a continuous work. We have to have a clear institutional structure. With this, we would be effective in public management. Another important challenge for the public sector was the need to react fast to different developments. In a short period of time, the work had to change so that people could get the main services and that the provision of services is continued. The Ministry of the Interior actually made some achievements in this area. We had to identify the key services, what are the key services, and ensure that the provision of those key services ensured to the population. Institutions were recommended to do away with unnecessary formalities. Therefore, the standardization of the public services is a recommendation and a future vision. The services in any circumstances, be it a state of emergency or normal situation, those services could adapt and change easily under any circumstances. Obviously, the pandemic and its undefinability helped us to define the direction of the public services. The situation of the quarantine showed another problem, that the society lacks skills to use digital means. Therefore, digitalization and electronic services is a direction that we need to move in. And we need to look for some comprehensive solutions that will help us in future to adapt to one or another circumstance. Another important challenge that the public sector faced, in my mind, was that the transition to remote work in some cases was complicated. Well, some services were able to do that. Some institutions were able and were prepared for that. Some institutions did not have necessary IT possibilities, but with time, we managed to be flexible, to reorient ourselves, and I think this is not a problem today anymore. The Ministry of the Interior, after the first wave of the pandemic, made research and it interviewed 121 institutions and public sector staff after the first wave of the pandemic. And its aim was to to see what was the experience of the public service, staff of public service. First of all, the research showed that more than 84% of civil service servants gave positive evaluation to their work during the quarantine. The flexibility of the environment and the flexibility of the agenda was mentioned as an advantage of the remote work. The need for flexible working environment was seen as a priority before the pandemic, and during the pandemic we saw that this was a must in the public sector. And actually this could be seen as an incentive to involve more people into the public sector.
Patvirtinti jau tyrimų, tai labai įdomu ir žinoma, tai duoda pagrindą jau.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
Iš esmės, kas buvo paliesta jau prieš tai abiejų diskutantų išsakyta.
As both participants of the discussion mentioned, the continuity of the discussion is key. Public sector has no chance to be shut down. So probably that's why we have so definite challenges during this complicated time. I see Mantas Varashka, the mayor of Kazlų has also joined us. Mantas, could you please present some insights from the perspective of the municipalities? Thank you. Good morning to everyone. I'm working from home, so that's why I chose this space picture instead of my kitchen picture. I will probably speak from the perspective of municipality in general, not just my own municipality. I would say that we have had a crisis of project activities because all of us do have a lot of projects with foreign partners, with our national financing institutions, and we had the period of financing which started in 2014, and 2020 was a very important period. Therefore, we had a lot of delays, a lot of requests addressed to agencies, project management institutions regarding the postponement of the deadlines In many cases, the COVID pandemic was indicated as the main reason, and also our inability to perform the obligations. Another thing is the financial crisis. Starting from April 2020, we stopped collecting income tax, and the problems regarding performing of public functions appeared. There were some entities who didn't have any reserve. Since this year is called the last year when we can still go back to our project financing, is quite complicated fact, because even we know we can get some money by lending, by borrowing, I'm sorry, we know that we will have to pay back this money sometime in the future, which stops us. The labor resource crisis was another point. Many of our staff members have started working remotely. The government has stressed the need for allowing people to work from home as much as we can, which is quite a big challenge, because even the private sector indicated they do not achieve the same efficiency as while working from office. On the other hand, there was an observation that instead of having inability to work because of health issues, instead of the sick leave, people choose to work from home. I would not like to go too deep here, but we did have the crisis of labor resources during the crisis. The nomenclature crisis was already mentioned. Not all the municipalities managed to implement the shift fully, and my municipality has also faced a similar problem, and it was only in the beginning of 2020 that we have managed to get all the subordinate agencies into our uniform system, electronic system, including the electronic signature and things like that, so that we could have all our assignments and resolutions remotely. Still another moment was the crisis of strategic planning. 2020 and 2021 was the period when we were supposed to work on our strategic plan for the future. So everything we were planning in 2019, let's say, became completely outdated. And here I mean the priorities of our municipality. And since our municipality is supposed to focus on tourism, but again, we have some projects like, let's say, Via Baltica, the transport infrastructure project. It seems that we will have to change our priorities depending on the development of that project. So today we find ourselves in a very unclear situation. We cannot make our priorities for the next coming 6 years. And I believe that many municipalities are facing a similar problem. The crisis of transport and communications was quite painful also. We could either finance the transport company carrying 1 or 2 people to work, or refuse funding altogether. And then if we close the funding, of course, people would complain that they are left without any communication at all. Today, we have a situation when the communication is restored. Still another point, emotional and social crisis of our population. The municipality also has its own customers, communication, understanding, tolerance, patience is on the verge, I would say, and we have more and more situations, quite stormy ones, when the service providers lose their patience, and this is becoming increasingly hard. The mass media, different internet portals do have a very negative impact on people's emotions. I'm not speaking about some bullying or incitement of hatred, but just the negative pictures that are being created. Speaking about COVID-19 pandemic, I would also like to mention the focus on some really insignificant aspects. What we lack from the government is probably the regulations that would be in force for a longer period of time instead of fast changes. The regulations seem to be changing every week regarding meters and centimeters. When we start applying them, we see that the situation has already changed. And to conclude, I would like to put it as a wish, perhaps. The biggest mistake we have made in 2020 was that the theme and the strategy of COVID became the topic of political communication. It was included in the election campaigns, and there were different approaches presented. And if political parties would have decided to take this topic out of the campaign, we would have probably reached much more. This was my insights about this problem. Thank you to the mayor. A lot has been mentioned, and now I am looking at our professors. May I invite Professor Vainius Malskys from Mykolas Romeris University, perhaps? And we also have Mantas Bileišis from the Military Academy. Professors, I would just like to ask you to keep to the time frame if you can. Yes, okay. Thank you. I agree with the mayor and also the former minister. The pandemic emerged during the election period, and that's why probably it was inevitable not to speak about it. However, the control system of the pandemic remained quite similar as far as the lockdown is concerned and the numbers of those infected. I think we had similar measures implied here, maybe with the exception of Slovakia, as we heard from Professor Juraj Nemec, and maybe also in Poland. We have some colleagues from Poland here, and we will hear their insights. There were many similarities, I believe. On the other hand, the communication with public was at the focus of attention at all times. And probably this is the weak point, both regarding the former and the current government. Maybe the former government had a more lively cooperation with the population in terms of information. As far as the significance of professional skills are concerned and competences also, I believe that this is something that we lacked. However, on the other hand, we understand that the competences is something that can be developed, and we are developing them in a very complicated period and conditions. And taking something as an example from another country, adapting them here would be very hard and probably not really wise. So we are really coping with this big challenge. If we don't speak about the war period, but in the sector of healthcare, the competences are probably developed at the forefront, as I would put it. The remote forms of work have evolved, including the electronic services, which is a welcome fact. And as far as the remote forms are concerned, of course, we did have problems, especially in local governance field. Many municipalities joined the remote work. But to summarize, I would say that all the processes that have taken place can be assessed perhaps positively. And the efforts of both governments also are quite positive. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to Professor Mantas Bileišis. Well, it is very difficult to make this deep insight. Well, I try to think before getting the invitation. I will speak on more general terms. When we speak about the management of such type of crisis, the measure of success is the duration. Professor Nemec said that during the first phase of the pandemic, we had this mobilization of society, and then we faced a fatigue. And there was a lack of predictability, the lack of confidence and trust. Trust and predictability is something that lacks in our public administration. There are also many structural problems, for example, anti-vaccination movement, the lack of communication. The state becomes one of many actors. Another dimension of predictability. If we speak about military, ecological crisis, in all those cases, the content and the reaction requires some professionals. But if we don't have general preparation in our society, our communication has to be very comprehensive. And here we have only one decision. South Korea, China, and other Asian countries have a very successful way of management. They have a real exercise, and this gives birth to trust and confidence in the process. And the great question for us in Europe is how much do we need to invest into that? Barack Obama, Bill Gates, and other speakers spoke about the forthcoming pandemic, but it is very difficult to convince the public that the investments need to be made. When we speak about the less possible threats, it is very difficult to mobilize the society. Speaking about the wide variety of crises, we need to have a certain vocabulary and a certain muscular memory. So in management or public administration, we have the standard of management. We have to think of an ISO standard for crisis management so that this vocabulary becomes common among different countries and it is mutually understandable for all. Thank you, Andrius. Thank you, Mantas.
Ačiū, dėkoju. Taip, antras klausimas tada.
The second question for the panelists. Well, what are the best practices of the public sector in managing the pandemic, and what recommendations could be made for the future for our public sector? Mr. Mashunene, well, our advantage that we can act unanimously in a crisis. The public sector can change its focus, can refocus. This is our advantage that needs to be developed further. The mayor presented the actions on the local level. They had a great challenge, but when we speak about the public sector, the segment of institutions was organized quickly and successfully. From one headquarters, we moved to hundreds of homes. Well, it was a hard job. We have to use this in future. It helps us to create remote jobs and in regions too. Why can't say civil servants work from different regions in Lithuania? This direction could be used by the central government. Remote meetings, conferences like this one We actually miss the physical contacts, but speaking about the efficiency of the public sector and quality discussion, this format, I believe, will remain in the future after the pandemic and after the state of emergency. We also ensure the possibility to take the decisions when we need a specific voting of politicians, and this is an important point. The pandemic actually gave rise to the revolution of digitalization, and the positive advantages, the positive effects of digitalization can already be seen. This will also include the protection of data and protection of privacy. This is a huge work ahead of our country and ahead of our state. The mayor gave a lot of administrations. The mayor mentioned a lot of challenges. Municipalities also can plan their work ahead, so this self-sufficiency and trust should be strengthened. Civil defense and security service needs a change and needs restructuring, and we need to involve the general public so that the public can understand that we need to be aware of all possible threats and that we have to be prepared for all possible situations, rather than think that nothing will happen. One more important point that we didn't mention was the contribution of NGOs, associations, and volunteers into crisis management. This is a direction that we could strengthen because unity, empathy, mutual help in civil society is the advantage that has to be used. This would help us to strengthen civil society in general in reacting to different crises. Technological provision for the staff is also very important. We understand the need of different digital solutions, technical solutions, the use of cameras. This is a great package that has become a must for employers both in the public and private sector. When we have better technological solutions, we have better competences of the staff. Computer literacy increases as a result. And different skills to find information. The key strength that we have is our people that work in the public sector, civil servants, who accomplished many different tasks during the pandemic. The representatives from the Ministry of the Interior mentioned correctly that we need to raise the skills, improve the skills and competences of people working in the civil service. Thank you. Ms. Viena, well, many aspects have been touched upon. I will just add some of it. We have learned to invest into people. We must invest into people in order to strengthen their competences. We are ready for that. And the pandemic showed our weaknesses, and this is the area that we have learned. Another recommendation is communication. Communication should change. It should be targeted at every person, every resident, about services, about other public processes. Communication should adapt to the situation. When we speak about the best practice during the pandemic, the entire public sector that was very flexible to adapt to the remote work. When a doctor gives you a remote consultation, you save doctors' time and patients' time. So this form of work is a recommendation. We have to save our time. This could help to reorganize the work of the public sector to be more effective. And another aspect which was revealed during the pandemic, digitalization is the area that we have to head to. We have to do some digitalization tasks in order to move forward. Thank you, in a very structured way. Mr. Mayor, please, the floor is yours. Well, a coffee is a must of a conference. We can at least drink coffee online. Financial sustainability is a challenge. We have a bottleneck phenomenon when we are at the end of the financial period, but we need the money here and now. We need it not for consumption, but to be able to create the well-being so that €1 could generate €4, or at least €3. We have different bilateral projects. The government should be informed in the near future that municipalities should be considered through a different lens. We have this VIP lending coming from the government, but it is rather complicated now. We have to be helped to implement investment projects. This issue is very important, and the possibility of greater funding would be better for us. Another aspect as a challenge and as an opportunity, it was difficult for many residents to move to remote communication and electronic services. What should be done in the future? We, the people, have become more literate in terms of electronic communication. The electronic service gate should be improved. This is, should be renamed into not the government service gate, but the resident service gate, because we have to see the end user as the main actor here. This would be our way forward. This digital space is joined by many people, and many people have certain electronic certificates, and we have to improve this area by creating a user-friendly public services portal. Thank you. You have a very specific proposal to have a more friendly public services portal. Professor Vainius Malskis. Well, I agree to what has already been said. The pandemic will not end as of now. We hope that we will improve the situation by vaccination, but we have no guarantees that other challenges will not arise. We have the situation that, well, I agree with Mr. Bileishis on the standards of crisis management and definition of those standards. And in a critical situation, the colleagues mentioned decentralization, the concentration of local governments. If we face similar challenges, we have to thank that vertical management during the crisis, the competences of central government and involvement of civil society, effective communication, as well as a guarantee to possible overcoming of these crises. This is a new way of addressing the challenges. Well, when I spoke, I had in mind the future possible crisis. Okay, we need to focus on our competences in these areas as well. Professor Mantas Bileishis. Well, I want to finish with an optimistic note. Well, this communication in a triangle actually reflects the emotional status of the society, but I was surprised that during the management of the crisis, the voluntary efforts were revealed. We had the potential to concentrate the efforts to find the ways. And in the public sector, we had some kind of pride in the service. We need to strengthen that. From the times of the Sąjūdis, we have the impression that we are not friendly as a society, but the crisis showed that the civil service is a positive thing and that we still have patriotism in us to react in a positive way. And we might question whether this is realistic, whether this is genuine. Thank you, Mantas. Ladies and gentlemen, do you want to react to the to the remarks made by your colleagues. Well, many of you reacted in your speech. So let us see, do we have questions? We have one question, but it has already been answered by the panelist. Will the public sector become more smart, more innovative? Maybe would like to add to that. I think should we have the bigger or smarter public sector after the COVID-19? This is the question. Do you have any answers to that? Should we have it smarter or bigger? Sigita? I will try. First of all, in the public sector, we have a lot of institutions. So the question is optimization and standardization of some of the processes will show that the sector has to be smaller. The pandemic will help us to become more smarter, to introduce smart solutions and in order to have the public management that is in line with the public needs. Yes, I think that it will become smarter. We have remote work, we have different remote services being provided. That already shows that we are smarter. Technologies and technological revolutions change a human being, but this does not mean that certain areas will not require strengthening. In this sector, we will need some amplification. Speaking about administrative services, I think I agree with the Ministry of the Interior that after the consistent analysis and in presentation of functions, we will be able to choose smarter solutions instead of a whole crowd of staff in one or another areas. Education, I think, is waiting for great change and development. It is a huge change, and the pandemic gave rise to this change.
Dėkoju.
Thank you.
Rašo, kad greičiausiai
Well, I see that
finansavimas yra ribotas, bet sumanumas taip ir panašu, kad
I see Mr. Uri Nemetz has reacted. Bigger probably not because of limited finance. Smarter seems this is not related to pandemics, but to demand. Smarter in narrow term, yes, electronization would progress. I have looked at the YouTube platform. The discussion is going on there as well, but I don't see any question to us there. It's still delighting that people get involved. We have time for the last question, maybe. Well, I see we have an interesting remark on YouTube from a listener who said that the remote work opened up many possibilities for those living in the periphery, because now we have a chance, much more possibilities to participate in different seminars and conferences. So these are the comments of our listeners. Okay, we have some positive comments, which is very good. Colleagues, the time for our session is coming to an end. I would like to invite you to a lunch break and then to join different sections after the break. I would also like to ask the staff of the Office of the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania, particularly the Committee on State Administration and Local Authorities of the Seimas, who ensure the communication and the sound quality during our conference. They really have made a very good job. Thank you to all of them. And I would like to thank you for the participation. Also, a big thanks to the professors, all the participants of the discussion, for your time. I believe that such discussions have a lot of benefit. We see a lot of people interested on YouTube also, and I hope that in the future we are going to make further progress. Thank you so much. And if I may allow you, the conference is not yet over. As Andrius has mentioned, the conference will continue in sections. We will have 3 sections in total. After lunch, we will have presentations in the Lithuanian language about Lithuanian experience, section A. We will have section B, international experience of entrance in the public sector activities in the context of the pandemic, presentations by our foreign guests. And we will also have section C, a discussion, a public consultation on the interaction between public governance institutions, what lessons we have learned. Therefore, I kindly invite you to join the sections after the lunch. See you there. Thank you once again.